Learning objectives. At the end of this topic, you will be able to explain the significance of life processes for maintenance of life, relate the processes of nutrition and respiration with a part of metabolic activities. Introduction. Meena with her auntie. How do we tell the difference between what is alive and what is not alive?
It's simple. Whatever is performing some action is alive, and whatever is stationary is not alive.
If we see a dog running, or a cow chewing cud, or a man shouting loudly on the street, we know that these are living beings. What if the dog or the cow or the man were asleep?
Right.
We would still think that they were alive. But how did we know that? We see them breathing, and we know that they are alive. What about plants? How do we know that they are alive? We see them green, some of us will say. But what about plants that have leaves of color other than green? They grow over time, so we know they are alive, some will say. In other words, we tend to think of some sort of movement, either growth-related or not, as a common evidence for being alive. But a plant that is not visibly growing is still alive, and some animals can breathe without visible movement. Let me tell you about maintenance process in living organisms. What are life processes? The maintenance functions of living organisms must go on even when they are not doing anything particular. Even when we are just walking in the road, even if we are just asleep, this maintenance job has to go on. The processes which together perform this maintenance job are called life processes. These maintenance processes are needed to prevent damage and breakdown, and so energy is needed for them. This energy comes from outside of the body of the individual organism. So there must be a process to transfer a source of energy from outside the body of the organism, which we call food, to the inside, a process we commonly call nutrition. The outside sources of energy could be quite varied, since the environment is not under the control of the individual organism. These sources of energy, therefore, need to be broken down or built up in the body and must be finally converted to a uniform source of energy that can be used for the various molecular movements needed for maintaining living structures, as well as to the kind of molecules the body needs to grow. Oxidizing reducing reactions are some of the most common chemical means to break down molecules. For this, many organisms use oxygen sourced from outside the body. The process of acquiring oxygen from outside the body and to use it in the process of breakdown of food sources for cellular needs is what we call respiration. When chemical reactions use the carbon source and the oxygen for energy generation, they create byproducts that are not only useless for the cells of the body, but could even be harmful. These waste byproducts are therefore needed to be removed from the body and discarded outside by a process called excretion. Let's consider these various processes so essential to maintain life one by one. Nutrition. How do living things get their food? We know that energy is needed to maintain a state of order in our body. We also need materials from outside in order to grow, develop, synthesize protein and other substances needed in the body. This source of energy and materials is the food we eat. The general requirements for energy and materials is common in all living organisms, but it's fulfilled in different ways. Some organisms use simple food materials obtained from inorganic sources in the form of carbon dioxide and water. These organisms, the autotrophs, include green plants and some bacteria. Other organisms utilize complex substances. These complex substances have to be broken down into simpler ones before they can be used for the upkeep and the growth of the body. To achieve this, organisms use biocatalysts called enzymes. Thus, the heterotroph survival depends directly or indirectly on autotrophs. Heterotrophic organisms include animals and fungi. Autotrophic nutrition. Carbon and energy requirements of the autotrophic organisms are fulfilled by photosynthesis. It is the process by which autotrophs take in substances from the outside and convert them into stored forms of energy. This material is taken in the form of carbon dioxide and water, which is converted into carbohydrates in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. Carbohydrates are utilized for providing energy to the plant. The carbohydrates which are not used immediately are stored in the form of starch, serves as the internal energy reserve to be used as and when required by the plant. A somewhat similar situation is seen in us, where some of the energy derived from the food we eat is stored in our body in the form of glycogen. Let us now see what actually happens during the process of photosynthesis. Firstly, absorption of light energy by chlorophyll. Then, conversion of light energy to chemical energy and splitting of water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. Later, reduction of carbon dioxide to carbohydrates. Let us see how each of the components of the above reaction is necessary for photosynthesis. If you carefully observe a cross-section of a leaf under the microscope, you will notice some cells contain green dots. These green dots are cell organelles called chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll. We know that stomata are tiny pores present on the surface of the leaves. Massive amounts of gaseous exchange takes place in the leaves through these pores for the purpose of photosynthesis. But it is important to note here that exchange of gases occurs across the surface of stems, roots, and leaves as well. Since large amounts of water can also be lost through these stomata, the plant closes these pores when it does not need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. The opening and closing of the pore is a function of the guard cells. The guard cells swell when water flows into them, causing the stomatal pore to open. Similarly, the pore closes if the guard cells shrink. Heterotrophic nutrition. Each organism is adapted to its environment. The form of nutrition differs depending on the type and availability of food material, as well as how it is obtained by the organism. For example, whether the food source is stationary, such as grass, or mobile, such as a deer, would allow for differences in how the food is accessed and what is the nutritive apparatus used by a cow and a lion. There is a range of strategies by which the food is taken in and used by the organism. Some organisms break down the food material outside the body and then absorb it. Examples are fungi like bread molds, yeast, and mushroom. Others take in the whole material, break it down inside their bodies. Some other organisms derive nutrition from plants or animals without killing them. This parasitic nutritive strategy is used by a wide variety of organisms like cuscuta, amarbel, amarbale, ticks, lice, leeches, and tapeworms. How do organisms obtain their nutrition? Since the food and the way it is obtained differ, the digestive system is different in various organisms. In single-celled organisms, the food may be taken in by the entire surface. But as the complexity of the organism increases, different parts become specialized to perform different functions. For example, amoeba takes in food using temporary finger-like extensions of the cell surface. Which fuse over the food particles, forming a food vacuole. Inside the food vacuole, and the complex substances are broken down into simpler ones, which then diffuse into the cytoplasm. The remaining undigested material is moved to the surface of the cell and thrown out. In paramecium, which is also a unicellular organism, the cell has a definite shape and the food is taken in at a specific spot. Food is moved to this spot by the movement of cilia, which covers the entire surface of the cell. Nutrition in human beings. The alimentary canal is basically a long tube extending from the mouth to the anus. We eat various types of food which has to pass through the same digestive tract. Naturally, the food has to be processed to generate particles which are small and of the same texture. This is achieved by crushing the food with our mouth. Since the lining of the canal is soft, the food is also wetted to make its passage smooth. When we eat something we like, our mouth waters. This is actually not only water, but fluid called saliva. secreted by the salivary glands. If it is to be absorbed from the alimentary canal, it has to be broken into smaller molecules. This is done with the help of biological catalysts called enzymes. The saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase that breaks down the starch, which is a complex molecule to give sugar. From the mouth, the food is taken into the stomach through the food pipe or esophagus. The stomach is a large organ which expands when food enters it. The muscular walls of the stomach help in mixing the food thoroughly with more digestive juices. These digestion functions are taken care of by the gastric glands present in the walls of the stomach. These release hydrochloric acid, a protein digesting enzyme called the pepsin, and mucus. The hydrochloric acid creates an acidic medium which facilitates the action of the enzyme pepsin. The exit of the food from the stomach is regulated by a sphincter muscle which releases it in small amounts into the small intestine. From the stomach, the food now enters the small intestine. This is the longest part of the alimentary canal, which is fitted into a compact space because of extensive coiling. The length of the small intestine differs in various animals depending on the food that they eat. It receives the secretions of the liver and pancreas for this purpose. The food coming from the stomach is acidic and has to be made alkaline for the pancreatic enzymes to act. Bile juice from the liver accomplishes this in addition to acting on the fats. Fats are present in the intestine in the form of large globules, which make it difficult for the enzymes to act on them. Bile salts break them down into smaller globules, increasing the efficiency of enzyme action. The pancreas secretes pancreatic juice, which contains enzymes like trypsin for digesting proteins and lipase for breaking down emulsified fats. The walls of the small intestine contain glands which secrete intestinal juice. The enzymes present in it finally convert the proteins to amino acids, complex carbohydrates into glucose, and fats into fatty acids and glycerol. The digested food is taken up by the walls of the intestine. The inner lining of the small intestine has numerous finger-like projections called villi, which increase the surface area for absorption. The villi are richly supplied with blood vessels, which take the absorbed food to each and every cell of the body, where it is utilized for obtaining energy, building up new tissues, and the repair of the old tissues. The unabsorbed food is sent into the large intestine, where more villi absorb water from this material. The rest of the material is removed from the body via the anus. The exit of this waste material is regulated by the anus. Summary. Let's summarize the topic. Today, we have learned that the maintenance of life requires processes like nutrition, respiration, transport of materials within the body, and excretion of waste products. Autotrophic nutrition involves the intake of simple inorganic materials from the environment and using an external energy source like the sun to synthesize complex, high-energy organic material. Heterotrophic nutrition involves the intake of complex material prepared by other organisms. In human beings, the food eaten is broken down by various steps along the alimentary canal, and the digested food is absorbed in the small intestine to be sent to all cells in the body.